Welcome back, Doubts Aloud listeners, to our festive special, a little pause in our presuppositional episodes either side of each other. And so today, keeping in with the mood of the season coming up, we are going to be talking about Luke as a historian and touching into the census and maybe other differences within the Gospels of Jesus' birth. And so taking the bull by the horns, on this right off the bat, is going to be Francis.
Okay, so the census that Andrew's referred to, people are probably familiar with it. It's supposedly what caused Joseph and the pregnant Mary to have to go to Bethlehem, where Jesus was born, which was all supposed to be in fulfillment of the prophecy about the Messiah. And there are a number of problems with this account given by Luke and with the supposed census, which we'll be going into more detail as we go through the podcast. But why does it matter? Well, it doesn't necessarily completely disprove Christianity. I mean, I don't think we're saying that, but that is something that a lot of apologists or Christians seem to misunderstand, and they'll sort of say, "Oh, well, what's all the fuss about? It doesn't, why are you making this big deal about it?" Well, the reason we're making a big deal about it is because it is so often said by apologists that Luke was a fantastic historian, and that this really gives credible everything he said. If you look at what he's written, you can check it out, and he's so often right. So he's just a brilliant historian, and he's really committed to telling what he knows, what he's got evidence of, and it's just, you should rely on it in the same way you should rely on every historical document. And so what we're saying is, well, not if you look at this census, that doesn't work. So if he's not a reliable historian, if what he's doing here is a narrative device to get Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem because he needs to have them there in order to be able to say the prophecy was fulfilled, then he's not a reliable historian. He's just somebody who's pushing a story and is prepared to pretty much say whatever he thinks is necessary to say, or to invent stuff so that he can get his point, his point made, the point that he wants to make, rather than the point that he stands back and objectively finds that the evidence amounts to. So that's why it's a big deal for us.
Yeah. Well, Merry Christmas, everybody.
Indeed.
People talk about this historian called W.A. Ramsey, and he's from a generation or two back. But his big thing was to show how Luke got things right in Acts, particularly the second half of Acts, when they do a kind of go on the road and tour the bits of the Roman Empire. And he gets lots of stuff correct in terms of the local geography and the local politics, the names of certain government roles and things he seems to get right. So that's where this comes from. And so is it important that we're talking about something 50, 60 years earlier, earlier in the past, farther into the past from Luke's point of view?
What?
Yeah,
Sorry, you mean
50 years is a long time, even today, where we've got a lot of access to documents. And back in the day, they didn't have the internet. They didn't have printed books. It's very difficult to get hold of any information or to track people down. So 50 years is a big old chunk of time to be able to find out what happened then.
Yeah, and what happened is important rather than is the setting accurate. There's different things.
Yes, agreed.
Actually, there's a very interesting thing here, just to link back to the whole Mormonism one that I did and the research I did on that. Somebody said something that I hadn't quite articulated when we did that episode, but it was to do with the fact that the reason there's so many problems with Mormonism is because we have so much evidence that we can go back to. but it shows you all the problems and the contradictions and the differences and the arguments and the falling outs and the different perspectives. And that's why they have a lot of trouble, because there's almost too much information, but it doesn't all point to a nice picture. And so I thought that if that's the case there, then what would have been happening possibly is various differences of what's happening, different ideas, different stories coming down, and we'd have more evidence of that if we weren't so far away from it, if you see what I mean. And so I think you can get away with a lot because there's very little. And that may be beneficial to apologists because there's not a lot to go on. But I think if you had a lot, we may actually find ourselves not better, but actually more. Do you see the point I'm making?
Yeah.
Because it's certainly with that with Mormonism, they just go, we got this letter from his wife that says this, but I thought the doctrine said that, and then she wanted polygamy, and they didn't, and they fell out, and and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, if we had all this information on the disciples, I wonder how good they would come off.
That's that's right.
And the writers
yes.
and the way it came together,
Mm-hmm.
and looking at Matthew copying Luke, and if it was all up front and clear. In letters, I mean, to each other, like private correspondence. But anyway, that's just an aside.
Yeah. So I'm going to try and give a little justification of why we're wasting an hour of your time in the precious Christmas season on something as minor as about 8 verses in Luke. And is it accurate? To me, this is important because it's a real vital step in someone needing to convince me, for one, that the resurrection is more than just events in people's heads. The reason we think it could well be the events in people's heads is the way that it's presented to us in the first documents that we have from the New Testament, and especially this chapter 15 of the first letter to the Corinthians, which has got a very what claimed to be a very early creed or whatever, setting out the resurrection, which doesn't have an empty tomb and does have various appearances. And the appearances are equated to Paul equates them to his own experience of an appearance. And when he writes about that elsewhere, it sounds like a revelation in him. It sounds quite visionary, and he even calls it visionary in his words, put either correctly or not, put into his mouth by Luke in Acts. So there is all that. Later on in the chapter, this Corinthian chapter, Paul talks about the body of Jesus after he was resurrected, and he calls it a spiritual body, and then he goes so far as to call it a life-giving spirit. He says the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam, a life-giving spirit. And that word spirit can be translated ghost, like the Holy Ghost. And when the only time really, or a big time, the main time that we have Jesus as a non-ghost in the gospel descriptions of his resurrection is in Luke. Luke has Jesus turning up in the upper room and eating fish in front of the disciples. And he actually says, touch me and see me. A ghost does not have flesh and bones as you see I have. And it's that same word. So Luke might be consciously correcting what he knows from 1 Corinthians, or he might not be aware of 1 Corinthians and earlier sort of theology on this. I suspect he is correcting something by emphasizing that Jesus does have a real proper body. And so that's why suddenly kind of the details of what Luke says, can we trust him or not, becomes quite an important thing on the table. And it's very rare that Luke says anything that in terms of a fact, an event that can actually be cross-checked and given some ground truth over. So this is one of our few opportunities, and it's Christmas. Let's go for it.
Yeah, good place to start on testing the author of Acts and Luke.
Okay, so let's read the passage. That's a good place to start. I think Andrew, you got everything ready. Could you read Luke chapter 1 and just verse 5?
Okay.
In the time of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zachariah who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah. His wife Elizabeth was also a descendant of Aaron.
Okay. So the key thing is it says it's in the time of King Herod. That's when it all starts.
Yeah. Yeah.
Verse 26 and 27 of that same chapter.
In the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, God sent the angel Gabriel to Nazareth, a town in Galilee, to a virgin pledged to be married to a man named Joseph, a descendant of David.
Okay. So we've got it as starting in Nazareth, and it's clear how Joseph is a descendant of David, and that's important to Luke. So now the story carries on. John the Baptist is born, and they start and have to sing some songs and stuff. And then we get to chapter 2, and this is the key passage, chapter 2 up to verse 8.
Okay.
Please.
In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to their own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house of the line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn son, a son. She wrapped him in cloth and placed him in a manger because there was no guest room available for them.
Okay, so the story carries on in a familiar way, but unrelated to the census. So now we're following their movements, and let's jump to verse 22.
When the time came for the purification rites required by the law of Moses, Joseph and Mary took him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. As it is written in the law of the Lord, every firstborn male is to be consecrated to the Lord, and to offer sacrifice in keeping with what is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of doves or 2 young pigeons.
Okay, so we follow them now from Bethlehem back up to Jerusalem and the temple. And let's finish things off with verse 39, please.
When Joseph and Mary had done everything required by the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own town of Nazareth. And the child grew and became strong. He was filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was on him.
And then the very last thing that's of relevance that we could mention is the genealogy in the next chapter, which again re-emphasizes that Joseph was a descendant of King David. So, Andrew, before we get into the history stuff, under the assumption that Luke is being quite fast and loose with the facts, what do you see as his agenda here, his sort of theological agenda or whatever, with his David thing and Bethlehem and all the rest of it?
Yeah, I think it depends on how one is coming to the text and looking at what it's actually saying. But I think that the crucial element here, as in going to Matthew as well, for that matter, is that well, actually, just to make the point now, there are vastly different stories there, but they both get Jesus to Bethlehem. So there would have been a motive and a desire to have Jesus in Bethlehem from somebody that they knew was from Nazareth. And so in which way do they do it? Well, in Luke, we've got this particular scenario of a census that gets you to get down to Bethlehem, have Jesus born there, and then they can go back home to Nazareth, where everyone knows they're from, it seems, from that tradition. And so that, to me, is the overarching reason for all of this. But that could be seen as a skeptical view, and not, and therefore that would be challenged maybe on just skepticism alone. But it seems to me that when you compare it with Matthew, they both seek to get Jesus to Bethlehem.
Yeah. And Luke mentions 3 times that Joseph is a descendant of David, even though he's not supposedly the kind of biological father.
Yeah, I mean that's one of been. Funny enough, when that struck me many years ago now, I probably it was only about 15 years ago when I was at university studying theology, and it hit me in the classroom when somebody was saying something, and it was like, oh, hang around, he's making all this argument that it's a son of David and a descendant of David. You would have assumed it was blood descent. And then suddenly it goes on to say, and of course, it's a virgin. And so suddenly you think, well, the one before would have been relevant, but not Jesus. And so, and then I think in both, I mean, just as an aside, what do both of you make of that?
I mean, I think it's difficult to see why they would do that, but I believe that apologists, to my mind, sort of fudge it a bit by saying, oh yes, in Judaic terms, if he was his stepfather, he would be his father. But yes, I mean, it just doesn't fit, does it? If Jesus is supposed to be, or rather, if the Messiah is supposed to be descended from the house of David,
exactly,
then he does need to be able to trace it back to. I mean, just having a stepfather, I can't see how that's supposed to cut it. I really can't.
Or trying to make Mary a house of David, which some people try.
Yes, isn't that what Matthew?
Either.
Is that what Matthew does? That his genealogy links Mary to the.
I think I've heard Bart Ehrman talk about this quite recently. He's got a podcast going, which I'm really enjoying, called Misquoting Jesus.
That sounds good. I'll have to get that.
YouTube and on podcast, yeah.
And I think in going back to his original strength of digging over copying errors and trying to work out what the original manuscripts might have said, I think there's a big issue that Luke might well have said that Jesus was indeed the normal birth son of Joseph. And it's been edited out either by design or by the copyist forgetting that, making a kind of mistake, thinking we all know.
The Ebionites apparently had that view, and so there was a sort of talk in the early church on how did they come to have that view, where did that stem from, because all these sources sort of develop and everything else, and that they saw Jesus as from what I remember anyway, the Ebionites saw Jesus as the Messiah, but as a human born with both parents kind of Messiah, and therefore maybe if there was an original story that had that, and then suddenly the virgin birth sort of came in as a later sort of idea, you'd sort of insert it there and not necessarily realize you've undercut your entire point. But funny enough, I'll tell you this now. This is really interesting. I mentioned before that I met Bart Ehrman and had these conversations. We did talk about this, and I brought up the point to Bart, which I don't think that he thought I was going to make the link, because we were in another conversation earlier on with the whole table. This was the second time that I met him. It was a whole table of us this time, and he was talking about the fact of the adoption was such a big thing in that culture that the adopted son could take over and actually be more of a son than your actual son. And he was talking about it with another area of conversation. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I said, some people might want to use that argument, Bart, for this, and say that actually, if you're sort of adopted into the family, you can take over and be the thing. And he actually said, I can see what you're saying there. He said, that's a good point, because I was linking two different conversations into one thing. And I think some apologists would probably jump on that if it's true that adoption can hand over the kingdom to people. And I think there's a storyline in Ben-Hur like that with the Charlton Heston character. He becomes the son of the big high up Roman citizen, and was almost a glorified character there. And
it's a big deal. Yeah, it happened a lot.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I think some apologists, again, this is what we'll find out as we talk more about this, that apologists will jump on all kinds of things to try and sort something out in terms of to make it historical. But again, this keeps the pot boiling, this sort of thing. But I would say, going back to the actual point, the natural thing is that you think a descendant going down the bloodline means that Jesus would need to be a blood descendant of David. And Luke makes that point, even though he talks about Mary a lot, but he makes the point that Jesus was the son of Joseph and descendant of David. And so I find that quite obvious, really. And then this thing does throw it out, because it's like another theology with a spanner in the works of what was the theme,
Yeah.
So anyway, that's what I'd say on that.
Okay, so that's not our problem one.
No.
Problem one is more on the history.
Yes.
Well, they're all the problems are supposed to be checking Luke as a historian, as Francis said right at the start. So the problem one is there's no record of Caesar Augustus's decree that all the world should be enrolled, because enrolled is the very transliteration of the Greek word for census. And the Romans did keep extremely detailed records of these sorts of events. That's the claimed problem that we're going to look at first. And under that, I've got a couple of things to say before we get too far in. One is that actually, if we ditch the world, the kind of Roman world wide, that the Greek is entire Roman world, I think, is when you do a Bible hub that gives you the Greek words one by one, and the Roman bit is, I think, just assumed by everybody. But if we take that out and just have a census under Quirinius in Syria, no problem. There's a lovely record of it. Josephus talks about it, and I think it might be known in another way as well. So it's only when we try and make it an Caesar Augustus decree for the whole world that suddenly there's nothing there to see.
Now,
Now,
I mean, what?
Okay, carry on.
I was just going to say, why do you think Luke made I mean, why did he sort of go that extra step and say it was the whole world, do you think? I mean, why didn't he just say it was a local one? What would have been driving him at that point?
Well, the whole world was local as well in that context, the Roman world.
Well, okay, but
yeah.
you know what I mean. Rather than saying the whole Roman, everyone under the Roman jurisdiction, why not just say there was a local census and people had to travel to where their families came from, which in itself is problematic. But I just wondered why did he stick his neck out like that? Say, oh, it's everybody living under the Roman Empire. They all had to go back to where their ancestors came from.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that.
I mean, I can't
it up
see...
a bit, maybe.
Yeah, I can't see why they couldn't have even had a story like after this in Luke, but we haven't read out yet. They go back down yearly, don't they? Or is it? I think it's every year, isn't it? To Jerusalem, and that's when you get to the point eventually where Jesus is 12 and in the temple, and they are going back down. So I don't understand why maybe you could have had Joseph and Mary and family going down like they normally did, and then this time she was pregnant, and then so they stopped off at. Couldn't go all the way back to Nazareth, and so they stopped off in Bethlehem, and the baby was born. They could have. That would have made it so much easier. Unless there's a problem with that, can you see any problems with that? Rather than this census of bringing David and a pregnant wife on a trek of that so many hours and hours and hours, and the pregnant wife on a in some kind of travel, whether it's the traditional vision of a donkey or whether it's another form. But that's, to me, it's just setting yourself up for problems of reality if you're trying to be historical.
Yeah. Okay, I want to talk about something which comes up a lot, particularly when skeptics talk to apologists, and that is this phrase, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. So you can sort of sweep away. People say, "Oh, well, there's just because it's not mentioned, that's not evidence of absence. It's just that." I don't like that. I find that lazy. Yes, of course, evidence of absence doesn't have to be
absence of evidence.
Yes, so whatever. Anyway, it doesn't have to follow. It's all about expectation. This is not anything. People talk about fallacy, which annoys me even more, because fallacies are deductive arguments, but you only use evidence of absence arguments in more the kind of court style.
Yeah, I think it's called abductive reasoning. It's the reasoning to the best explanation,
which is what your barristers do all the time in court.
Yeah. Yes. And absence. I mean, it depends on the context. Absence of evidence is evidence of absence if the context is such that you would expect there to be some evidence. So, for instance, if I go into the kitchen and somebody says, "Oh, there's an elephant in the kitchen," and I go around the kitchen and I open all the cupboards and sort of, listen, and there's no sign anywhere of an elephant. I mean, that absence of evidence is evidence of absence. It depends. There are others. There can be circumstances where absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence because the context is such that you wouldn't necessarily expect to find any evidence. So, for instance, if somebody says, "Oh, last week I lost a penny." Well, and then you go into their diary and you say, "Oh, there's nothing in your diary here about losing a penny." But, losing a penny isn't something you would expect somebody to record in a diary. So it's kind of irrelevant.
Yeah.
But, there's no overall rule. And it's not a fallacy, which a lot of people think it is. It's not a fallacy.
I mean, I found this tension, not tension, but the reality in observation with apologists is that they use this, it's not, sorry, hang on. So if you can't find any evidence, they say, well, that's not meaning it's not there, basically, isn't it? It could be there and we might find it later. When it comes to the Exodus and all this sort of millions of people, or thousands, 100,000 plus, so maybe 2 million in the end coming out of Egypt, and there's no evidence for that, they tend to say, well, that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. We may find it, but they haven't yet. But then they jump on the slightest thing with the biggest excitement, because it's acknowledging they haven't got evidence and they want it. It's look what's happened with this thing that we've just done with this what was it that
the curse tablet.
The curse tablet.
A few weeks
so they're going, well, it's okay, because it doesn't mean everything happens in this. So you would have thought that they'd make little fuss if they did find something. Well, we believe it anyway, but they go, oh my gosh, this will revolutionize the world. So it's the same with this. It's like when it comes to, there's no record of this census, particularly all going back and causing absolute chaos. I mean, that would be noted itself. You would expect someone to say something. And so obviously they're looking for evidence. But in the meantime, they've got to sort of, just use that argument. Yeah. And so and I find that they do this all the time. And then, they use the slightest bit of wording that comes from somewhere else, maybe decades later, 100 years later. See, this person says something similar, so it could have happened. So it's almost like, as long as it could have happened, we're happy.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to go back to this and ask, well, is there an expectation that if there was a worldwide, Roman-wide census, that we would have evidence for it? And do you know, write me down, my brother-in-law did a PhD in classics, and he was looking at records throughout the whole of the Roman Empire. The time as well as scope, and looking at sort of trade guilds, and how common were they, and what functions did they have? Were they just for funerals or wider and that sort of thing? Anyway, he said, actually, if there was a worldwide, Roman-wide census, you wouldn't expect to find, you wouldn't be surprising not to find anything, except in Egypt. You would definitely expect to find something in Egypt because of the way papyri don't rot when they're chucked out and left in the desert. Yeah. And as we know, heaps of stuff has come out of the desert. So he would be really surprised if there was a census at that time in Egypt, and there was no record of it.
Wow, interesting.
And of course, we do have evidence of one in Syria, which is what Luke mentions. But then he overextends himself and says the whole world, and whoops, nothing there.
Yeah. But it's argued that because there is this one in Syria, they say, well, there we go. It's not proof, but it means that it's possible. That's what they're saying, isn't it? They want to use that.
I mean, to me, the evidence is mounting up now that Luke has a problem here. But we've got two more after this. So there's a couple of in the research I've done and chatting to people online who are apologists. there's a couple of things that have come up that are responses to this. And have you heard of this, Andrew? The first one, that it wasn't actually a census in any way we'd understand. It was all about Augustus demanding that everybody acknowledges their allegiance to him, and that's something that did happen around about the right time. But
Oh, not familiar with that.
and then you would need to register people, because you might register people who are refusing to provide that allegiance, and that's their idea.
Right.
I've got a link to somewhere that is propounding this.
So again, it's inference of like manner stuff, and so
so what they're doing is saying that even though almost everybody who doesn't put enrollment in their English translation of the passage, they put something, they even mention tax or they mention census, but so nobody translates it in any way to suggest it isn't a census, but this is the idea.
Yeah.
So who was convinced by this thought?
Well, not me. I mean, there's what was the purpose of making someone go back to where their ancestors came from to swear allegiance there? I mean, wouldn't the more sensible thing to be to get people to swear in the places where they lived anyway, where you might have more access to records, so where if somebody hadn't sworn allegiance, it's no good knowing up in, well, that's how I see it. It's no good knowing in Bethlehem, oh, there's that Joseph, he didn't swear allegiance. I mean, what you want to do is to go and find where Joseph actually lives, and where people will be able to find him, so they'll be able to cart him off to prison or whatever they're going to do to people who don't swear allegiance. I mean, it's no good him not swearing allegiance up in Bethlehem. What's that all about?
Yeah, this ridiculousness of travel is going to be our problem too, and this certainly makes it a heap worse.
Yeah, because we sort of imagine in the stories everything that, even if it is a massive trek for a pregnant woman and Joseph and other family members doing this journey, but you'd have to imagine you're going with loads and loads of other people, like hordes of people. Where are you going? Well, we're going on a bit further than you, and you know what I mean. And then how would you know anyway? If somebody said this today, right, you've got to go back to your ancestor, 1,000 years before. How would you know the first thing to start? I mean, I can hardly work out when we do these things online anyway. When you do your tracing, it's work as it is, and that's with all.
We're coming to that. This is just.
This is just what the point.
Just saying how much this is a ridiculous explanation. And it does make that problem even worse. Yeah. And again, I note that look, we have got a perfectly good tax-based census that Luke seems to be referring to. Is at the right time with Quirinius as governor, and we've got evidence for it. And yet you're ditching all that to say, it's this other thing that doesn't sound like a census at all. Or, it doesn't sound enrollment at all. Swearing allegiance isn't enrollment.
Yeah.
It didn't, Anyway, so I just found that pretty...
That they've made the link. They're trying to find anything, really. It sounds like, okay, they're trying to do an accumulative case of like minor concepts.
Yeah. Okay, and the other pushback that I was managing to get was the idea that, we do have records of censuses. We know of one in Syria, one in Gaul, one in Spain, but of course they don't coincide with the dating that this would need to be, so I don't see how that helps us at all.
No.
They quote bits of Tacitus that says how there were, like even Augustus himself had handwritten a kind of description of the resources of the state, including numbers of citizens, under allies under arms, fleets, all that sort of stuff. Well, that doesn't sound like a census to me. And if it's something that Augustus could, in his spare time, could write with his own hand, it doesn't sound like a very big document to me. So I can't see that as
No,
like a census
that's
result.
not credible, is it?
Yeah.
No.
So I don't know what we should do now. It's just to say we've won, move on, or to give.
Well, I suppose I think we've got a fair amount of ground to cover. So I don't know about whether we've won or not, but we've certainly expressed our views.
Yeah.
It should be enough to raise anybody a question and a raised eyebrow
Yeah.
when reading and going, okay, I want to find out about the history, the background, what else, who else mentioned this? Because you would have, and again, this expectation of something, not just a census, but something with the travel back to their ancient ancestors' places, that itself, I would have said right off the bat, just reading this, well, I would expect somebody else to mention this,
Yeah.
and to say it was chaotic for a few years, even though it was meant to be a few weeks or something, because this happened and this, but it doesn't seem that it's mentioned by anybody in terms of explicit thing, and so what's more likely,
Yeah.
So that's what I think is the essence of this particular aspect. Yeah.
And then problem 2, I've heard Francis talking about quite a lot over the years, in online chats, and that is the reason for this 3-day journey. So over to you, Francis.
Well, I think we're now coming on to the issue about how people were supposed to get back to where their ancestors had lived, whatever that means. And as you were saying, Andrew, even today, when we have these resources, we have you can go online, you can find your, we've kept meticulous genealogical records, and even before you could go online, you could go to Somerset House or wherever, and you could look at, as long as you had a few names, you could look it up. But people generally didn't know. I mean, people don't. Most people, if you ask them, 1,000 years ago, can you name one of your ancestors? Well, the only ancestor you can generally name is, because apparently we're all descended from him, is what's his name? The Great. That German king. What's his name?
Frederick?
Begins with C. Oh God, it's a senior moment here. It's
not the French one.
Charlemagne.
Yeah.
We're all everybody in the West pretty much is descended from Charlemagne.
Oh, okay.
Of course, everybody. You can work it all out mathematically, because everybody who's ended up alive, there's a limited number of ancestors that you can have, and you get to the point where somewhere in your ancestry has got to be Charlemagne. But anyway, you can Google it if you like. That is true. That is absolutely true. That almost everybody who lives in the West, who comes from, whose ancestors do come grounded from the West, you will find that if you trace your family back, Charlemagne's in there somewhere. Anyway, but that just goes to show how difficult it is, and how many potential ancestors there were, and which ancestors' home were you supposed to go back to, even if you knew it, even if you could work out what your lineage was. How did you know that you're going to go, that person even was in your lineage? And if you did know it, what was the point in going back there? I mean, how was that going to help the Romans? I mean, the Romans weren't stupid. They had a big empire to run, and they ran it on the whole fairly effectively. That they were big into efficiency, I believe. I'm not a historian, but that's my sort of perception of the Romans, that they wanted everything nice and orderly, and they tried, they managed to keep the show on the road for quite a long time, and they wouldn't have done it by sort of coming up with completely, bonkers ideas. Yes, I was looking.
Batshit.
I wanted to say batshit, but I wasn't sure if I was allowed to say batshit.
Well, if the Home Secretary is allowed to say it.
Oh, well, okay. Yes, he's an
So
authority on these
begs
things.
the question then, totally, of the point that we're actually trying to make, is that this is so unhistorian-like to actually come up with
Yeah.
something like this, that it's like that it makes you sort of go, oh, how can he possibly be a great historian with this story? And it just like you have to then of course that's what encourages apologists who say, well, we need to find some way, whatever you do, come back and find out that he's make sure he's a good historian.
Yeah, and I mean the thing is, if you wanted to know about people, you wanted to know for taxation purposes, you wanted to know about them in the town where they actually lived, because that's where you could chase them up. I mean, that's where you could work out whether, oh yeah, you haven't declared that field over there, have you? That's a bit iffy. I mean, up in Bethlehem, they weren't going to know whether Joseph was declaring all his property correctly. I mean, it's like if you had a poll tax. Can you imagine if? I mean, I know nobody liked the poll tax, but can you imagine if you'd had the poll tax and you'd said not just you're going to be taxed on the borough that you're living in. Oh, you've got to go back to the borough where your ancestors came from, and then we'll work out how to tax you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And a census also applies to us. Oh, sorry.
Oh, okay.
Okay,
we have got
go
some
on.
historical records here to help us. So Josephus himself, this census in about 6 AD or CE, does talk about people were taxed on their estates, which means their lands and things like livestock and stuff. So we do know that if it was a normal census, then that's what's going on. We also have from Egypt, but this is from 104 CE, a document that sets out a census and explains how people have to go back home. So most people are either home already, but if they're out and about, they have to go back home for the census, because that's where, as Francis has been saying, you are is the basis of your registration. This document will come back later, actually, in the discussion. So we do have some historical records as well as just common sense to back up what you've been saying. Let's move on to there's one other problem here, and that is, if the census was when Josephus says it was 6 CE, and when the dating of Quirinius being governor would suggest it ought to have been, then there's another problem, and that is that after Herod died, which is what we're going to come on to in a bit BC, about 4 BC, I think 6 BC, there was a lot of political stuff going on, and it ended up with I think one of his successors, his kingdom being split up a bit, and then one of his successors being useless. Anyway, the Romans took over Syria, or the relevant bit of Galilee and stuff, and Nazareth in around about AD 6, and did this census for tax purposes. But at that time, the Bethlehem was still it was in a different jurisdiction. So if we're going for this later date, AD CE 6, then we've got another problem that you've got 2 tax jurisdictions, one that Quirinius is in charge of and one that isn't, or not directly, and so it makes the tax even more stupid and complicated.
Right.
But that's an if related to everything's connected to everything, to this dating issue, which will be our third problem we'll come on to.
Right.
So I guess if you're happy, we'll now come on to what people have come back with as
responses to basically
as just kind of how to get around it. Now, one is the idea that Joseph himself, Mary and Joseph did have land in Bethlehem, and that isn't exactly what is being said, but if we assume that's what is being said, then that would solve it, or give a partial solution anyway. And now at this point, I want to introduce you to a professor of ancient history at Basel University. So she seems, I'm not going to be biased. Even if she's Christian, she's fully legit, proper university, not some theological college. She's called Sabine Hubner, and she's written a book quite recently, 2019, called Papyri and the Social World of the New Testament, Cambridge University Press. And apologists love it because they have she's moved it more in making a bit of sense of all of this by showing, this is why I mentioned it, goes back to that Egypt document from 104 CE. And under that, people say who were civil servants or whatever working in Alexandria were commanded to go back to their farms so that during the census, so that they could be properly registered for the land they owned out in the sticks. And that was a command. You couldn't wriggle out of it by saying, oh, I live in Alexandria, so I'm going to get away from this. So there is an example in the Roman world, but 100 years later, of people actually being commanded to move from where they normally sleep each night to where they need to be registered. So the key phrase she ends up with after all of this is, in this light, Luke's description seems thoroughly realistic if one accepts that his intent was to leave his readers with the impression, so it's a bit complicated language, if one accepts that his intent was to leave his readers with the impression that Joseph's family was originally from Bethlehem and owned some property there. So just before we dive into that, how much of an explanation would it work for you if Joseph actually did have some land in Bethlehem?
Well, I suppose I just think that if that was the reason, why didn't Luke say that was the reason? Why didn't he just say he owned land in Bethlehem? Why did he say because he was from the house of David? Because he could be from the house of David and not own land there, or he could own land there and not be from the house of David.
If the underlying thing was that it's very, very important that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, even though people seem to know Jesus was from Nazareth, then you could say he was going down because he owned land and that's why they're there. Again, another scenario far easier. If you know what I mean? So it's like you have to get underneath everything to try. So basically, it's like go away and come back and find out how it happened, because it did, and you say, okay, this is another way to do it, and rather than the convoluted story, which it's getting more and more as we look into these differences and absurdity of it, that it's this is just one way. It could have used that very argument, as you're saying, Francis. You could have said that.
Yeah. So why? She sort of makes it the whole world doing this, and he's saying, this is verse 3 of Luke 2, and everyone went to their own town to register. So if this Egypt evidence is worth working on, you'd think only a very small minority would go to their own town to register because they would already be there.
That's right. And of course, there's the reference to Nazareth being their own town. So,
that's very confusing.
Yeah.
Because we're working on Luke alone here, as if it was the only information that we have. But a lot of the issues are actually brought up precisely because of Matthew, who says a different narrative, basically. And so you've got, particularly with the Nazareth one there, that Matthew makes, to me, it's absolutely stand out clear that they were arriving for Nazareth because of Archelaus was now there. And so they couldn't settle back in Matthew. They were based in Bethlehem, but because they couldn't settle there, they went and settled in a land called Nazareth. I mean, that is crazy. Why not just say, and so they went home to their other property, So,
Yeah.
yeah. And so you've got, but Matthew, when you combine those two, that raises a whole new set of problems. That's what happens. My earlier point, once you start having lots of people say stuff, things get more complicated, not easier.
Yeah.
Yes.
But this is just Luke alone. So within Luke's own narrative, we got all these problems.
Yeah. I think Francis's introduction was emphasizing that, look, we've got Matthew who's clearly making stuff up, and you could tell from his prophecies and all that sort of thing. And we've got, John, who's so theological, and you can't believe that Jesus could possibly have said the stuff in exactly the same voice of the narrator, and all that. So it goes on. But we've got Luke. He's the historian. So that's why we're concentrating particularly on the internal evidence and the documentary evidence around of whether Luke is the one who's got it right. Luke's the adult in the room, supposedly. We can rely on him, even if we can't rely on the others. And we're saying, well, hang on a minute, let's have a look.
That's the thing, that he's what people are really nailing their colours to the mast on. That you can't argue with Luke, can you? He's reliable.
A couple of points, one of which I think is pretty weak. Somebody we were using as a source claimed that Joseph owning property in Bethlehem, it doesn't really work because it's in contrast with his destitute status and Jesus's birth in a strange stable. And he thinks that even if he did own some property, that there'd be at least a few shacks on it for him to stay in. Francis and I have talked about this, and neither of us think that's a particularly good point. It's more of a guest room. In fact, that came out in the translation that Andrew used. So there wasn't a guest room, so they had to stay with the animals downstairs.
Yes, I mean that's something that's been put to me by apologists in the past, and I think it is fair enough. I mean, it doesn't specify that they had to say that it wasn't necessarily a stable, but there were some animals involved. But that wouldn't have been that extraordinary at the time, that there might be a room where you would have the animals in there at night. You would bring the animals in there at night, and I don't think that's our strongest point. And let's face it, we've got plenty of strong points already without having to rely on ones that are not greatly supported. And also, we don't know that Joseph was destitute, and we don't know much about him.
Really. Luke certainly doesn't say so.
No.
Okay, and then the other point, I don't know if this is any better. Why is Mary joining in this difficult journey when she's about to give birth? If it's only Joseph's issue to go down there, why can't she stay with her mum or something?
One thing that somebody argued with me was that Joseph wanted to remove her from the area because tongues would have been wagging, because they weren't actually married and she was pregnant. So he was trying to, shield her from the scandal.
So we got scandal. We start off with a scandal. Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean,
yeah.
You've got to say something.
Yes, I suppose so. I mean, if tongues were wagging, if she's that heavily pregnant, I mean, it's a bit late. It's sort of shutting the, no pun intended, but the stable door after the ox and the ass have already bolted.
Yeah.
I mean, I thought about this today, and I was just thinking, I was just trying to put a natural, more reasonable conversation to Joseph, to Mary. He says, right, fortunately, Mary, there's a census. I've got to go back. I've got to go all the way down to Bethlehem. I won't be long, be as quick as I can. The family here can look after you. It would be a shame if I missed the birth, but how many fathers have in the centuries? Probably have. But I'll go down, do what I need to do, and come back. Whatever you do, stay resting. I'll get family members, and of course that culture did have surrounding loads of family members, didn't it, compared with more modern cultures.
Yeah.
At least over in the West. And so I would have said that. I would have thought that would have been, imagine if that was the story, you'd say, yeah, that has a ring of reality about it. But up you go and say, I'm sorry, Mary, but you're off with me. Why do I have to go? Well, just, I just rather have you with me, And so to me, that was just a conversation milling around in my mind on that very point, Fred. Sorry, Ed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we're happy, we can move on to the most famous of the problems. And that is the dating of it. People often say, oh, well, Matthew has Jesus born under Herod, and Luke has Jesus born under Quirinius, who was 10 years later. That's a problem. But actually, Luke chapter 1, verse 5 that Andrew read also has the story starting a year before Jesus' birth with Herod as king. So it's an internal problem with Luke as well as a tension with Matthew. So people say, well, we kind of the historical record has it that Quirinius was governor of Syria in the around about this 6 AD time, and he was busily assigned to a campaign in Asia Minor, which is like Turkey nowadays, from 11 down to 3 BCE. So that's after Herod had died. And people often say, oh, this is Luke versus Josephus. Josephus bases this census in around about AD 6, and Luke puts it in Herod's reign. It's Luke versus Josephus. Why believe Josephus over Luke? You're favoring him.
Yeah.
But there is other evidence outside of Josephus as to what Quirinius's dates were and what he was up to in the decade around when Herod was at the end of his reign.
So there's some corroboration for Josephus.
Yes, you have. There's a Wikipedia page on Quirinius, and that gives some other bits and pieces. So if you want a careful review, there is a reference we can put in the notes, which I haven't actually seen myself, by Joseph A. Fitzmyer from something in 1981. It's an Anchor Bible, so it's probably not skeptical, dishy kind of. So we have some possible solutions provided for us. One of them is that Quirinius did have some kind of role in Palestine during Herod's reign, despite mostly being over in Asia Minor. This involves looking at the Greek word for governor, and I think it's widely agreed that you can be some kind of ruler of a territory or even a top administrator without actually being the governor. He was the governor of Syria at the right time. There's no record of him having anything else to do with Syria prior to that, during Herod's reign. But you can weasel away and say, well, just because we don't know of it doesn't mean it didn't happen. He could have had a kind of summer break to run a census in the right time. That's the claim. And this just hasn't been recorded. So you'd have to push back on that. You have to get stuck into the details of the history and why we know Quirinius was in Asia Minor during those years and all the rest of it. So I'm afraid it's now beyond my pay grade.
to look into that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. I actually do find this juggling around with the various states. I find that quite difficult to follow. Got to say.
Yeah. But so it's definitely kind of a Luke versus Josephus, but Luke versus other sources as well. And you end up saying you're having this sort of implausible thing that Quirinius did have his two roles in Syria, even though only one of them is actually marked in history, and he's seemingly working elsewhere at the time.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a stretch.
It's all the cumulative thing here is all building up, isn't it? Like anybody coming to this and say, right, we need to sort this out over here with this. Okay, that might be possible. We sort this out with this, it might be possible, and then we need to sort this big one out over here with this. And then you start to think, what happened to the plain reading of scripture? Like fundamentalists often like to argue, I'm just, as Ken Ham would say, I'm just reading the Bible, and it's very plain, 7 days creation. Why do all this gymnastics behind? And then suddenly another part of the Bible, you're doing all this gymnastics behind. To say, in other words, it isn't a plain reading anymore, because it says if you read it plainly, you'll come up with these problems. So we need to now fill you in with all the detailed, skilled sub-layers to make it all work. Isn't that really what's happening here?
Yeah.
Because you could rewrite it. You could rewrite it. If someone says, go away and write what he should have written, and it would all be brilliant, wouldn't it? You could say, there wasn't this, you wouldn't even have a census. You would say something else, and you could say that's very, very, very plausible. You could say something else, and that's very plausible, and you could explain yourself as you're going along, and you could rewrite the narrative and have none of this. So there we go.
Yes, that's kind of it does come across just a rearguard action going on to try and defend what doesn't work.
Yeah.
Okay, so I've got two other possible solutions. One is that people go to the Greek, as you've been saying, and make it say what people don't translate it as. So this is the word first. This is where Luke says this is the first census that was under Quirinius. And people say, oh no, you could translate it before. That's so saying this was before the census that was done by Quirinius.
Yeah.
But even apologists, there's Cross-Examined, which is a fairly famous apologetics outfit with Frank Turek, I think he's called. So they do a blog, and even when they try and sort of dodge and dive, when they get to this one, they say no, it's a stretch, and they report that most scholars agree that first is the better translation. So that, in other words, this doesn't work.
Okay, well, it sounds like we don't have to spend too long on that one.
Yeah.
And
this exactly fits with what Andrew's just been saying, and both of you about the it's a plain reading is fine until it isn't.
Yes.
Yeah, Roger Forster was arguing for this, and even though he admitted it's based on, there's two manuscripts that say before instead of first, out of all of them that say first. And the argument is this a slim one again, isn't it? It's like saying these two little adjustments over here, which probably may have even been in the manuscripts because people were trying to make it happen. Who knows? As time went on.
Yes.
And they're trying to say, okay, we got a problem here, so why don't you make it before? So even then, it would be a problem. But to say, so the argument you're saying then, Ed, is that somebody's saying this is the first census, or this was the census before the first census. Is that what they're trying to argue?
It was the census before Quirinius did his census.
Yeah, very clever, very clever. And it's like, and it's not the most likely translation by any means of what I've read. And it's like, like you say, once you get another apologist saying, well, it's a bit embarrassing to use that, so let's not. And so, but yes, to say it was the census before the one with Quirinius, it's like, well, why not say Quirinius is the second one then? And so,
why does Luke make such a big deal of it if it's not even the one he's talking about?
Yes, that's right. This was the census before Quirinius, the one with Quirinius. To me, again, it just all adds up to this cumulative case of special pleading, with possibilities on their own, but massive improbability when all added up.
Yeah. Okay, so this is with one leap it's free, because if this cleverness works, problem 2 and 3 are solved. And this is a chap called David Armitage from Tyndale House in Cambridge. So it's a sort of bit like the Oxford Centre of Christian Apologetics in Cambridge, only maybe a bit more academic. Anyway, he came up with this theory, and it was published in a proper paper, theological paper, and about 2018, I think. And his idea is that Luke, the whole chat about the census, is a, what's he call it? A flash forward. Yes, it's a flash forward. So for some reason, he talks about all of it in a out of the thread of the narrative. So he's talking about the return visit by Mary and Joseph from Nazareth to Bethlehem, after they'd already, or Joseph had already done one in the census in they go back to Bethlehem in this fast forward insert in AD 6, even though the actual birth was back in Herod's time. And
right.
a key idea in this fast forward is that Luke has a wording that oh dear, sorry, my notes have disappeared off me. He has a wording which I can't remember the exact English transliteration of, that is an indication that he's saying, I'm taking this out of sequence, and that occurs at the beginning of verse 1, but it also happens again in the wrong place. So I better go to Luke 2 myself to remind myself. Now my notes have disappeared.
Was it something like in the time of? Was that his?
Something like that, yeah. So verse 5 about Joseph, he went there to be registered with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. Now, his second parenthesis thing happens after that sentence. So I just don't see how this is working at all. And then it says, while they were there, the time came for the baby to be born. I think it's the while they were there. There's something clever in the Greek that indicates when it's Luke writing that it's a jump in time. But verse 5, he went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child, is within the fast forward. So it's just not working to me.
Sorry. So what's the chronology? They go there.
The chronology is, we have the setup. Interestingly, this is part of his case. The end of chapter 1 of Luke has John the Baptist as a young child. So that could be in about the right time for this second census, for this census that's in AD 6. And then you jump into chapter 2. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree, and that is now in a fast forward of the story of Mary's giving birth. So Elizabeth has given birth to John the Baptist. He's now 10, and we've fast forwarded to an event with this census, which is when John is about 10, and then we jump back to Mary being giving birth to Jesus back in the original timeline.
And how does he square that? How does he square that with Elizabeth being 6 months pregnant when Mary came to see her, and Mary was pregnant.
He doesn't. That's not a problem. That's all squared. But the story then carries on just about John being born, and
Right.
it ends up with. Are you still there?
Yeah. Can you not
Good.
hear me? Yeah.
My computer's all melting in front of me.
Oh God.
I'm trying to get stuff. Okay. At the end, I'll give a pause. Yes, Francis, that's not a problem, because at the end of chapter 1, we are still in the story of Elizabeth. So the stories overlapped when Elizabeth was 6 months pregnant and everything. Then we carry on with just Elizabeth's story, giving birth to John the Baptist. And then it moves right on to John the Baptist being a young child, I think growing up in the desert or something. And then we jump to chapter 2. In those days, Augustus decreed a census.
But how could Mary be pregnant at the same time as Elizabeth, so that
the narrative is in Herod's reign at the beginning of chapter 1.
Yeah.
They both get pregnant and John is born.
Right.
Now it drifts forward 10 years because of John has grown up, but we've left Mary parked.
Oh, okay. I think
then
I see. So they were born within a few months of each other. Are we clear about that? That John the Baptist.
That's right. Yeah, Luke is saying that overall, according to this
theory. Okay. Now I've got it. Yeah. Okay.
So we fast forwarded to the census, which is in fact when John is 10.
Right.
And so the census is nothing to do with
Jesus
being born.
Right.
And the idea is that the journey to Nazareth from Nazareth to Bethlehem was just as like it was back in the day. Was it repeated again, rather, in the census time? So I don't know why he thinks that Luke's going to this great effort to tell us all about this census, which is nothing to do with the story of the birth and doesn't deliver for us Luke's aim, which is to explain why Jesus was born not in Nazareth where he grew up, but in Bethlehem. Yeah. And it's got this weird thing that you have to move a verse outside the parentheses as well to make it work.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Well, it all sounds quite complicated, which in itself is likely to make it less persuasive, but there we are.
That is my material on how apologists have covered these 3 main objections.
I mean, I think anybody listening to this should realize, of course, this is just one aspect of problems with history and problems with comparing it to Matthew. And so it only gets deeper and more complex from here on, when you talk about other issues. Did you want to mention, both of you, some of the other issues that you're aware of with Luke itself and also with Luke in comparison to Matthew?
I don't know the 2 stories well enough to say anything intelligible on them without having done some significant prep beforehand. But yes, yeah. I mean, I think there's I was going to say it's a point that I know Ed has frequently made, which is that where they're kind of left to where Matthew and Luke are kind of left to their own devices, that's where you get the big divergence. And it's, you do feel like they're each making stuff up as they go along.
Yes, or just inheriting different traditions that they're sort of working through. And that even then has split in scholarship, as I'd mentioned to Ed off air earlier, was like Mark Goodacre, as we've talked about, compared with, say, Bart Ehrman, have different views on this. But when you align up Matthew with Luke, there's a couple of points of agreement, like a virgin birth and the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem. And then from almost then on, it just diverges unbelievably. And the common standard view is that where Matthew wasn't copying Mark, because Mark has nothing about this, he starts his narrative with Jesus like just bursting on the scene in his 30s, evidently. And so there isn't anything about the childhood. And so nor is John. John sort of starts off in the universe before everything began and then sort of heads straight into a similar to like Mark in a way. So we've only got Matthew and Luke. Now, most people concede that Matthew copied Mark, and therefore it's so strange and kind of obvious that when the beginning of Mark doesn't have the appearances of Jesus. It's just one note of there will be an appearance, but it doesn't have a narration of the appearances. And so that's when Luke and Matthew go wildly divergent. The point you're making, Francis, and then wildly divergent on all this business to do with Jesus' childhood and the birth and everything is just so different. And so one of the clear things from that point of view is that they inherited different traditions or made stuff up theologically. But then you get someone like Mark Goodacre who says that, in fact, Luke did know Matthew. And that makes it probably even worse in one sense, because it means that Luke was going, well, I don't really buy this. So I'm going to give you the correct story. Yeah. Now, I'm not against that. I'm just thinking I tended naturally to think, isn't it interesting that they go wild where they don't have Mark? It's odd. But on the other hand, you could say, well, when they don't have Mark, Luke is saying, well, this is what happened, and Matthew's saying, no, this is what happened. So just to go through, just to say, we haven't hearing Ed at the moment because I think Ed is lost.
No,
his...
I'm here.
You are here. Sorry,
I said so much. I'm quite pleased that.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. I thought you'd said
a
note saying I can't get back in or something.
Yeah. No, I lost the outline. You
lost the outline. Okay.
Yeah.
And sorry, I thought you meant you lost your line. I read it wrong. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, not the outline of the story. And so one of the differences is that even though there's an agreement on the birth, in Nazareth, and it's the birth of Jesus, they differ so much that it's actually quite incredible. So we've been talking all about the Luke internal consistency problems and problems with history, but there's the problems in laying the stories side by side. And like for example, in Luke, you've got Jesus born, and then he goes to the temple for the dedication, and they go back after the law of 30 days or whatever it is, and they go all the way back to Nazareth. At the same sort of feeling that when you read Matthew, there's the fact of the killing of all the children by Herod. And then, and if you're going to see it as both babies at the same time, which is not the only way to see it, you're going to say that whilst they're in the temple, the Herod is going around, wanting to kill children and stuff. And then they go in Matthew off to Egypt to get away from everything. And whereas in Luke, they go straight back to Nazareth. And so it's very, very problematic. Some people appeal to the fact that, and I'm sure you're both aware of this one, that in fact, in Matthew, it talks about they killed the children because by the time the wise men get to Jesus, he could be anything up to 2 years old, and he's living in a house.
Yes.
And therefore we're talking about a child or a toddler, and that makes sense of going to kill anything under 2 years, which is very different from the baby scenario. But the problem with that is that Luke, Luke's one is a baby and they go right back. But it would then involve a scenario that they're traveling down to Jerusalem the next year, and then the next year, and then all this Herod stuff kicks off, and then they go to Egypt, which Luke doesn't mention at all. And so it's just as problematic if you have a toddler in Matthew and a baby, and then you've got the problems like with Matthew. This is another story, isn't it? But the whole thing about the star, you would have thought something so significant would be mentioned by Luke, and the star does something crazy, like it stops over Jerusalem. So they stop off and have a word with Herod to say, where is he born? And then the star leads them to the stable. Why not go bypass Herod and go straight to the stable, And so, or the house, should we say. So that's just a narrative of some of the differences.
It's fun that we just laugh at the star stopping over the stable and that sort of thing. And nobody tries to defend it and say, oh, well, if you look at this document and read Greek that way, whereas with Luke, they're trying a lot harder when it's sort of this crazy idea that everybody goes to the town of their ancestors. From
Yeah, I
1,000
suppose
years
they
before.
hammer in on that as conceptually sort of, I don't know, let's just try to imagine it. Whereas the star, well, the people try to do it there. They say, well, it was a comet or something. But as a comet, can it lead you anywhere? I mean, you could just follow and walk anywhere and say it's led you to it.
Yeah.
But it says it's whatever it was, it stopped. As far as I know, comets don't stop over place. And so it does read fairly sort of like, that some people say that, in fact, it might be a garbled, I don't know if you've heard about this, that it garbled evolving text that was originally talking about an angel guiding them and stopped, rather than a star in it. And that would make,
no, I hadn't heard that.
That's a very interesting one. Yeah. Rather than this sort of, let's look for comets or some kind of thing at the time. And then again, the bizarre thing about why didn't it lead it straight to the house? Why did they have to go and ask and stop off and have all that scenario? It's almost as if they needed to have the Herod story in there so we know what he's about to do. Then you've got the angel who seems to have a memory problem or sort of information problem, who says, get up, you can go back now. Herod's died? I think I'm remembering it right. And then another angel says, actually, you can't do that because Archelaus is in power. Well, why not have the whole thing from one angel? Let's go straight to a new place called Nazareth. Because why give you this, say let's go back, and then it goes, then they discovered another angel warned him in a dream. So the angel's obviously getting minute by minute information here. It's the sort of thing that these historical people don't want to delve with, angels and this sort of stars and stuff, as you're saying, Ed. It's much more, let's stick to Luke and his historical accuracy. But what about the word of God and Matthew's accuracy? So
yeah,
I always like the idea that, hang on it, there's a God behind all this.
Yes,
and it happened in Egypt even. So he is quite within his capabilities to have some wonderful document come out of the sand that suddenly corroborates all of this for the Victorians and everyone since. And wouldn't that be amazing? But God doesn't seem to be that interested in making these stories into rooted history, which he could do if he wanted to, if they happened.
Well,
yes.
this is
yes.
That's fascinating you said that, Ed, because that's exactly again, I have to go back to the Mormon thing. This is exactly what the Mormon apologist was saying, that if he wanted us to have the tablets still on show, he would have made it so. If he wanted us to find the DNA to make sure the Indians are actually of Jewish origin, then he would have made it so. But he's not. He wants us to have the faith, and it's like, wow, isn't that interesting for apologists of their sort to say that? But then they get really excited at this finding of a coin, or some kind of staff or something. So it's back to that again. It's like, okay, we'll do this for now, but when we find something, you bet the world's going to know, So.
Okay, well, I'm keen to hit the eggnog and start saying humbug to anyone I can meet.
Yes. Okay. Well, I think
you can't do both. You can't do both, Ed. It's a choice. Okay. It's one or the other.
I think there's been enough here for anybody listening to this podcast, and maybe even going back to our other Christmas themed ones where we've touched into an overlapping ideas here. But it's enough to make people go away and just read the narratives. And I think my takeaway point is that I think what's happening here is, to me, it's obvious. There's two things that are happening. One is that there's an assumption that the Gospels are simply all of one voice, a bit like you alluded to, Ed. It's all of one voice, and therefore it's I think the modern word, or some people use the word univocal. It speaks of one voice, and therefore you're forced by that belief to harmonize itself and to find the backing in history if it's historical one voice. And so once you see that perhaps these writers are writing their own book, they didn't expect it to be sitting next to another one, and they probably weren't expecting you to do deep historical research either, if it's more theology that they were keen on. And so they didn't expect, I don't think the author of Luke thought, oh gosh, they're going to be really hammering me for this. Do you know what I mean? Back in the day, 2,000 years time, when the Jesus was supposed to come back in a generation.
Meh, who's going to know?
Yeah. Well, particularly if the author was very much of the belief that Jesus was coming back soon. I mean, they're never not going to have time to research this, so they're not going to know. And so suddenly it didn't happen 2,000 years, and now we're on to you. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? And so there you go. So that would be my take. And what about you two? Like sum
Well,
ups.
pretty much the same. I think it's you know, you can only rescue bits of Luke at the expense of throwing other bits of Luke and large chunks of Matthew onto the bus, and you can't have it always. You know,
Yep.
it's just not going to work. There's just not
Yep.
enough credibility there to spread around so that it will cover the whole of the problems that you've got with Luke.
And just to remember another little history. If you're going to be this historical approach that Ed, you're bringing up, people are doing, why don't they take the same sort of thing with the same writer is writing, in Acts and similar sort of things, that Jesus ascended up and disappeared behind a cloud with two angels and the 8 people watching. Why that in the writing is meant to be as historical as anything else he's saying, and yet people sort of stay away from that. It seems to me anyway, because I can't find too much about it. Not like they defend the census. They don't. There's not so much on the ascension. It's just like, okay. Can we not mention that
well,
now?
Luke, of course, has the ascension on Easter Sunday in the Gospel, and the same author has it.
40 days.
Many
Bizarre.
weeks. So it's like he doesn't feel the need to be historically accurate.
And there's a change in the text as well. I remember this is in Bart Ehrman's book, The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture. I think it was. It says that there's actually textual change that people made, and they spotted this quite early on. And so what they did in Luke is they said to Jesus departed, not that he ascended. And so they've made it like, and then the ascension is in Acts to try and harmonize Luke with Luke. Because it's like, everything in Luke does appear that it's all happening within sort of a 12-hour space. Do you know what I mean? Meeting them on the road, and then he ascends, or whatever the word is in the general reading, and then he doesn't do it for 40 days in Jerusalem. So either he's not bothered about accuracy and time, or he's even changing himself as he moves along. So anyway, these are just asides.
I think it's a bit of both, because that was the culture of the time. They could just they could do that. They could play a bit fast with but then again, if you start to apply that to the what we've been talking about today, they could say, well, so what, that Herod is 10 years after Quirinius, and maybe he had to, in one sense you would say that therefore he's not careful, he's fast and loose, and unless of course all historians were fast and loose at the time and that was their way. But then we do catch them being fast and loose. I remember a discussion on one of our earlier episodes about the mother of Emperor Nero and her death, and it being all over the place with different authors, and you could see their bias in making her into a whore when clearly that was stupid, completely implausible idea. So their kind of bias and agendas and things were coming out in their writing, and the serious historians who look at all say, of course we can't trust these Tacitus, Suetonius, people who are revered as good sources. Well, in this case, we clearly
we got some same with Josephus. Josephus says some things like that,
so we just have to treat them all with a bit of a pinch of salt.
It's not like it's not just against the Bible. Josephus says some crazy things, like I think a cow gave birth to a pig or something in the temple, or something as bizarre as that. I'm just going off memory now, and it's like, okay, this is the guy that we're sort of correcting Luke by, because I had somebody tell me, well, Josephus is clearly wrong, because in other words, turning it around, because we often correct the Bible by other sources. And I tend to say yes, but when you've got multiple other sources, and we're talking about the Romans themselves documenting their own work, it's probably more reliable than Luke documenting Roman work. You know what I mean? Or some other writer. So there are reasons for that. But there's reasons to doubt, suspect everybody in one sense. And then
particularly when they have a strong agenda.
Yes,
which you can identify.
Well, yes.
So Josephus did have agendas. So
have some skepticism towards everyone.
Yeah.
And so nobody should say nobody has any agenda. So that's why you can say, well, Luke has no agenda. He's just narrating history. No way. Particularly if he wanted Jesus to be born in Bethlehem, he got a massive agenda right there, and so anyway, so
and of course
we digress, but
our doubts allowed. We have no agenda at all.
no agenda. And so, but
other than to give everybody an interesting good time.
Oh
yes, and a platform to think. And to go, okay, this is a good point. This is not such a good point, and this is why.
So let's sign off. Merry Christmas, everybody. And
yes,
it's goodbye from me, Ed.
It's goodbye from me, Andrew. Francis has gone already.
She's back. Yeah, she we lost her a while ago, but it was fine.
Oh, we lost Francis. Okay,
yeah,
fair enough. She got bored. She got bored.
She dropped off. It was fine.
And it's goodbye from Francis.